Hey FPS fans, what do Doom 2, Rise of a Triad, Heretic, Dark Forces, Future Shock, Hexen, Duke Nukem, Quake, Power Slave, Shadow Warrior and Blood all have in common? That's right, they're all first-person shooters. They all came out for the same system too, DOS. The most impressive thing about this selection of shooters, they also all came out within just 3 years, arriving between the latter half of 1994 and 1997. But it didn't end with DOS. Oh no. We also had Jedi Knight, Doom 64, Turok, Outlaws, Marathon, GoldenEye, and several others that also came out at that time. That's an absolute embarrassment of riches, and I don't need to worry about spoiling things by informing you that even in the boomer shooter revival period, nobody's hitting those highs in that short a space of time. The mad thing about this is it was happening in all genres around that time for DOS and Windows. RPGs? Ultima, Might and Magic, Realms of Arcania, Daggerfall, Final Fantasy and Fallout. RTS? Warcraft, Command & Conquer, Total Annihilation. Tactical strategy games? XCOM and Jagged Alliance duked it out. 4X, Colonization, Civilization 2, Master of Orion 2. In that short period of 3 to 6 years in the 90s, nearly every definitive title in every genre and its direct competitors were all released. And those that weren't, they were released around the turn of the millennium, just a few years later. A common complaint about the industry these days is that there's so much available to play and so many garbage titles clogging up the lists. Yet so many young players can't pick 5 great games that came out the previous year. Back when I was their age, I literally could not afford to buy all the games I wanted to play because there were too many good ones. Humour me for a moment and flash back to Lawnie in 1996. The Settlers 2, Tomb Raider, Lords of the Realm 2, Heroes of Might and Magic 2, Quake, all absolute stone cold classics, all released in 1996, and those are just the ones I wanted to play but couldn't. Instead I enjoyed Daggerfall, Civilization 2, and Pokemon Blue, when I wasn't constantly playing Warcraft 2, TIE Fighter and Dark Forces from the previous year, that is. I lived in a time of big boxes where it genuinely felt like an absolutely marvellous game was released every month. And thanks to the benefit of hindsight and Wikipedia, I can confirm that actually did happen. It all boils down to this. While there were less games companies back then than there are now and less games to grab your attention, there were more truly great ones being released and competing against each other for your wallet's precious resources. I'm going to stop the video here briefly because I actually made an image after recording which demonstrates just how many good games were coming out in 1996. It's absolutely ridiculous. In this vast, uncharted multimedia gaming landscape, you never knew what your opposition was going to do next. If we go back to our FPS comparison, in the beginning of 1996, Duke was king on build. Then the Quake engine showed up that same year. Then the year after, Kyle Katarn put his lightsaber through it with 3D acceleration. The year after, the first Unreal engine turned up, and another game called Half-Life. The FPS crown was like a hot potato being thrown about by different companies, and it felt like an arms race, with the player being the only true winner every time. Now, if you want to become a bestseller in that market, you need to be named Call of Duty. Or how about you prod that gaping void that is the lack of sequels to Skyrim and Grand Theft Auto? A huge opportunity for another developer to come along and take advantage of the lack of releases in that field. And yet, so few actually do. Also, so many other genres have essentially shut up shop over the last decade, partly because the industry just can't seem to bring themselves to create an alternative, and partly because development of such a thing is both such a costly and risky endeavour, involving those thousands of people I talked about in the previous video in the series. Instead, we have a stagnation at the top, where the same games are being released for newer systems, and the newer games in the genre are from the same handful of large corporations, sporting the same engines and a bare minimum of changes to story and gameplay. Possibly because the more money involved in these projects, the more institutionally corrupt they become, the worse their hiring practices become as a result, and leechers are drawn to the money. And the end result is that the big studios can no longer top or even recreate their masterpieces of yesteryear, because all the people responsible for doing so last time have either left or aged out of their roles. It's what I call a negotiated monopoly. All the big players are too big to fail, so there's a pretense of competition, instead of the actual competition we had in decades past. Battlefield isn't really competing against Call of Duty, and these huge developers are buying up more and more companies, and pushing as far as they can to own the most toys without the monopoly commissions getting on their back about it. They need that singular alternative in their field so they can point at them and say, "Look, we're not the only one here, it's not a monopoly." Back in the day, it took less people to create absolute classics, and that's being echoed these days in the independent scene, where if you're a developer with an amazing new idea, or a game that pushes the genre forward, then people will reward you. Or you could just release a side-scrolling pixel graphics platforming Souls-like with crafting elements and roguelike environments. Whatever. The indie marketplace suffers from the same problem as the AAA developers, despite its relative freedom. All the best ideas have already been designed. Remember the huge hype about Among Us? That was essentially a worse version of Trouble in Terrorist Town from Gary's Mod, developed in 2009 by Bad King Grain, almost 10 years before that. Gone are the days of a video games arms race. There will be no revolutionary title after revolutionary title anymore. You'll take your reskins and your re-releases and anniversary editions, and you'll like it. Or alternatively, you could go back in time to the glory days of the DOS era, through to the early Windows titles, and discover what great gaming you've missed out on.